Okay, now let's create our first animated section. We are going to make a new comp for each one, and they're all taking up a pretty small area of this main comp. But it can be a little more difficult to work inside a smaller comp, so we're going to animate each one a little larger and then shrink them down into this main comp. And that also means if we want to make a reduced version of this animation where it's only 4 of these sections or maybe 3 of them, we can scale them up and we won't lose any quality or anything like that. So first, let's go and create our new comps. Oh, and while we're here, in the project panel, you might notice a new folder called Solids that has been created. Now inside that, you'll see that is just our background layer here. After Effects will create a new folder like this whenever you create a layer like a solid, and it just keeps them organized. I'm just going to drag that into our assets folder because we don't really need to see what's going on in there. So let's create these 9 new comps, of course, in our comps folder, along with our mosaic main. And we're going to hit the new comp icon down here, and this will have the settings that we have last used. Now the width and the height is what we want to change. We need ours to be square, so these will need to be equal. Now I remember from Illustrator, I made these squares exactly 300 by 300 pixels, so we want to be working in a larger comp than that, and it makes sense just to double it, so let's make these 600 by 600. That way we just have to shrink it down by 50% and it'll be perfectly this size. And do make sure your lock aspect ratio isn't selected. If that is checked, it will keep the ratio that you have here. So if we had it 1920 by 1080, the aspect ratio was locked, and we went down to 600 and wanted to make the other one 600, they're each going to continually change. So when you want to change the aspect ratio, make sure that that is unchecked. And the aspect ratio just means the relationship between the width and the height of the comp. The other properties in here are fine. The duration 8 seconds, that is good. And we're just going to change the composition name to 01 and hit OK. And now we've got that comp in our project panel here. To make the same comp size for the rest of these, we could do the same process again, creating a new comp and do that 8 more times. Or we could just duplicate this comp. So with this comp selected, we can go up to Edit and Duplicate, and that creates a new comp, essentially copying and pasting it. And you might know this already or would have seen it up here, but the shortcut for duplicate is Control or Command plus D, and that is one you should commit to memory now, or you certainly will have by the time you're finished with this lesson, because that makes it much easier. So let's select this comp again, and we're going to hit Control and D, and that will make a new one. And we'll just hit that 7 more times from here until we've got 9. And notice that they are all being renamed as we duplicate them. After Effects can be clever sometimes, so when you duplicate a comp or layer that ends in a number, it will increment it for you, which is very helpful in this case. Now inside our main comp, we can have a look and choose which one we are going to animate first. Now we're going to start with number 2. If we look back at our numbers, number 2, our second from the top left, and this is the one where our circle expands outwards. And the only property we're going to need to animate there is scale. That is the focus of this section, so let's call our comp 02, comp 02 scale. So with it selected, I'm going to hit enter to change its name, and then I'm going to type dash and scale. And After Effects has put that at the very bottom of this folder because we have some characters after the numbers. So that kind of is ruining our alphabetical chronological order of these comps at the moment because some of them aren't fully named. So just to keep that in order, I'm just going to add a little dash next to each one of these, which only takes a second. And now they are all in the proper order, and it's just looking a little more clear and organized. We'll of course fill in the names for the rest of them as we work on them. So let's open up this comp just by clicking on it in the project panel. Now you can navigate between your comps also by selecting them down here in a timeline window. I much prefer to just do it in the project panel, mainly because if you're using a lot of comps, like if I just quickly open up all of these others, this section down here fills up pretty quickly, and they're not in any particular order. Well, they're in the order you open them in, which isn't really useful once you've opened them up multiple times and have gone in and out of different comps. I find it much easier, especially if our project is well organized, to just select them from here. I honestly just tend to ignore this down here and do everything from the project panel. Okay, we're in our O2 scale comp, and let's drag in our style frame as a reference, and let's move our circle into the middle. I'm zooming in using the scroll wheel on my mouse, and we are at 200%. After Effects will show you what percentage you're viewing in at the moment down here, and down here you also have the resolution as well. I normally keep mine at full or auto. I only ever go down to these low ones if I'm doing a very heavy project with lots of effects, and After Effects isn't showing me it in real time. If you've got lots of effects, After Effects will tend to slow down and you can't really view things smoothly, so dropping the quality makes sense here, which you can do with auto, but I like to keep it full just to make sure I'm viewing everything at its maximum quality, especially when we're working with such light shape layer based projects like this. Okay, we've got our style frame reference in here, and we're not going to trace anything. We don't really need to do that or use this that closely as a reference. It's just nice to have it here as reference for colors, and also just to make sure we're on track and be able to analyze it a little bigger. So this comp is mainly circles expanding, and we want to have these increasing in scale outwards in a sort of pulsating manner, and for them to loop as well. Now we can see from within this section we have got 3 colors visible at once. Now we can't see the edges of this larger circle because it is being cut off by the edges of its square confines, but we could infer from the design that could be another large circle as well. So we've got a much larger circle than our comp, and then we have one which is the exact size of our comp, or this square, or in our style frame, this square bounding box, and then we've got one which is about half the size as well. So we're going to create one circle, increasing in scale from nothing up to half the size of the comp, up to the full size of the comp, and then another size larger where it will be big enough that you don't even see any of the edges. And the good thing is we only need to animate that once. Then we can just duplicate that and make versions for the different colors. Okay, so let's get started creating our first circle. We can hide our style frame as well, so let's just toggle its visibility off down here on the left and create our first circle using the ellipse tool, which is up here in the toolbar. It is behind the rectangle tool, so if we select that by clicking on it, we have all the options of shape tools we have here, and ellipse tool is what we want. To the right here we have our fill and stroke options. Stroke is the outline of your shape. Now these will be the colors you last used, so mine are this nice gray here for a fill, and no stroke. The red line across it means there is no stroke at all. Now we do not want a stroke on our shapes, but for example, we can click on the stroke color, choose a random one, and if we click and drag in a composition window, it creates an ellipse with those properties, with that fill and that stroke. And next to the stroke we have a number. It currently says 8, and that is next to pixels, and that is the width of the stroke. So the width of this stroke is 8 pixels. And if we click and drag that, we can increase the stroke width or reduce it. And if you click on either the word stroke or fill, it gives you the fill options and the stroke options. So in fill options, we can choose the type of fill we want. At the moment we have a solid color, but we can choose none, and we'll see it update in the background here. We can choose a linear gradient, which is a fade from one color to the other, or a radial gradient, which is the same but in a circular fashion. So of course we want a solid fill. Let's hit OK. And the stroke, we can select that and we want no stroke, and hit OK too. Now by drawing the shape here, we have created a new shape layer. Now a shape layer can have one shape in it or multiple shapes. If we keep clicking and dragging, we create multiple shapes, but they are all within this shape layer. Let me drag this up a little further so we can see more of what's happening in the timeline. We now have 4 ellipses created within this shape layer. They are within its contents, and inside each of those ellipses, you can see more of its properties. We can see its path, which is the actual shape of it. We can see its stroke, which is turned off. We can turn that back on, and that gives that layer a stroke. We can see its fill as well, which we can turn on and off to hide it. And then it has individual transform properties as well. But we're not going to go too deep into shape layers in this lesson, but know that any property you want to change about anything in a layer will be nested inside its properties under these arrows somewhere. Now also when we're creating an ellipse or any other shape, if we click and drag and without releasing, we hold shift, it will create perfectly equal sides. We go to perfect circle, not an oval like this. That's if we hold shift. So that will create a perfect square as well, or a perfect star, depending on what other tool you've created. Okay, so let's delete this shape layer because we don't need that. And there is, in fact, an even easier way to create a perfect circle, which is the exact same size as our comp, and that is to simply double click our ellipse tool. So now we've got a new shape layer, and it is the full size of our comp. Let's change the magnification to fit as well, so we can see all of our comp at once. And we can also check that it's the exact width of our comp by going into its properties down here in ellipse path, and we can see its size is 600 by 600, the same as our comp was. And if we check our style frame, let's drag that over to the top. That is exactly what we want. And our fill color, I think, happens to be the exact color of this circle because that is the last color I used in preparation before making and recording this video. But ordinarily, we can just double click the fill color here, and we have this very convenient eyedropper, which we can use to select and change the color of our shape. So let's just choose this very dark gray color here. And let's hide our style frame. Okay, let's get animating. We want it increasing up from nothing in the middle to half the size of the comp to this full size and then bigger, even more beyond. And it's going to animate in kind of a pulse going boom, 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 boom. And forgive me for using sound effects. That's often the best way to describe how an animation is going to work without seeing it animated. There will be a lot of whooshes and foom and foo and things like that throughout this course. So we've already got it at the third size that we need. So we need it to be at a few states where it's smaller and one stage when it's even larger. So we need to keyframe each of those. Now I've already got it at its third size, so let's start from there. But when do we need that size? Well, we have 4 stages and we're going to keep it nice and simple, do 1 second each, which is just an easy way to space these out. And we'll keep that pulsing pace really simple through all the rest of the 9 comps when we know 1 second is how long it's going to take between each one. And of course, we're going to be animating all of those with the scale property. So we're going to bring that up by hitting S on our keyboard, which is going to hide all of these and bring up just that property. So at 2 seconds in, we are going to keyframe it by just clicking this stopwatch here. Now stopwatch is recording, which you can tell because it is highlighted with blue. So that is going to record any changes that we make to this property. So at the very start of the comp, we're going to drag our playhead over to the start, and we're going to click and drag these down to 0. And as soon as we make any change to these numbers here, now it can be very hard to specifically drag it down to 0, so I'm going to let it go close, and we can see it's already created a keyframe here, and then I'm going to select here, and then just type in 0. It's a little easier like that. And you can see it's created 2 keyframes. We go from 0 to 100 over 2 seconds. Our circle is growing. Now at halfway, at 1 second in, we want it at 50%. Now it is already at 50%. So just to create a new keyframe, we're going to hit the keyframe button here to auto remove a keyframe at the current time. And even though it was that size already, we're going to need to have that keyframe there for when we animate the pulsing. And then at 3 seconds in, we've gone from 0 to 50 to 100. We need to increase it to expand beyond the edges of this comp. And we've gone up by 50% so far. So let's just select and type in 150. And when you look at that, it expands nicely outside the bounds here. So it's filling up our comp. That's exactly what we want. So when we play it back, it is scaling up from nothing to filling the comp. So now we need to add the pulsing to these animations, which we're going to do by altering the speed of the animation so it slows down to a stop at each of these keyframes. And we can do that by applying easing to them. At the moment, they are linear keyframes. They are moving at a constant rate. They are expanding at the exact same speed. But if we select them all, just by clicking and dragging around them, we can right click on any of them, go to Keyframe Assistant and select Easy Ease. Now Easy Ease does have a shortcut which is F9, and that one isn't as easy to remember as Command D or Command S, the ones that you're probably used to using in other software. F9 is a bit out of left field, but you will be using Easy Ease a lot. So that is one you should commit to memory if you've got the space in there for it now. So we'll hit Easy Ease. And now our keyframes have changed this hourglass shape. They are now eased keyframes, which essentially means the animation will slow down as it approaches them, then stop, and then slowly build up speed as it leaves. Here's what that looks like. Now we are much closer to what we want. We've got a nice pause where each of these keyframes are, but we can make that even more dynamic. But to do that, we have to go into the graph editor to edit the speed even further. Now we enter the graph editor by selecting it from up here, the graph editor. Now don't be scared. Now many motion designers, when they're first starting, do whatever they can to avoid the graph editor. But you don't need to. It's not nearly as difficult to understand as it might first seem. You'll be getting very comfortable with this, and it is the absolute key to making compelling motion. So don't avoid it. Controlling the speed of how things move is really essential. So we're going to take a little moment to examine more closely how this works. I'm going to expand this a little bit more. And first, there are 2 ways to view the graph editor, as a speed graph or as a value graph. Currently, this is in the value graph. And we can see that if we go down here and select this, it shows edit value graph. Now we want to choose edit speed graph. So let's select that, and it changes shape. Forget about the value graph. Forget what we just saw for now. We're going to be focusing on the speed graph for the first 2 weeks. Now each are just a different way to see the animation visually across time. Both have their advantages for different tasks, and most animators will have a slight preference over which they prefer to use, but we're going to start with the speed graph because I think that is a bit more intuitive to start off. Okay, so the graph has 2 axes. It has a horizontal axis, which is time. So as we play it, we can see each of these points here respond to a keyframe. We have one at 1 second in, one at 2 seconds in, one at 3 seconds in. Now, if we want, we can zoom in a little closer by clicking this larger mountain and then scroll across. Essentially, we're just zooming in, and we can toggle between viewing the speed graph and the timeline just by clicking this here. That won't lose our place. So you can see we've just zoomed in on those 4 keyframes that we've made. All right, back in the graph editor. So the horizontal axis is just the timeline, essentially. And we can see these lines, these columns, are appearing at the convenient locations of 0, 12 frames, 1 second, 12 frames, 2 seconds, etc. And as you zoom in, more of those are going to show up, same as they do in the timeline. Now the vertical axis, that is what changes between the different graph types. In the speed graph, the vertical axis is the speed of the property, which here is the scale of our circle. So the speed is changing across time. Before, when it was linear keyframes, this would have been a flat line. The speed is consistent. It is not changing across time. It is one consistent speed. But now it is increasing and decreasing. And these points down here, they are at keyframes. So at every second, it is at its lowest point, its lowest speed, where it comes to a stop, where the speed becomes 0 on this baseline down here. Now the numbers on the vertical axis are the percentage per second. Now you don't really need to know that, but I think it's probably best to explain what all of these are so you can maybe get a bit of a clearer picture of what this graph is doing and what these lines, these curves represent. But really what you need to know, if its speed is at 0, it means it's a complete stop. The higher this curve is on the y-axis, on the vertical axis, is how fast it is. So if it's higher, it's faster. So at the start, we're at a complete stop and it starts moving. It gets a bit faster. And at this point here, it is at its fastest. So it goes slow fast, slows down a little here to a complete stop, speeds up again, starts to slow down to a stop, speeds up again, and then comes to a stop once more. The closer this curve on the graph is to the top, the faster that value of your property is changing. Now we can adjust the speed of these by using these handles, which you get by selecting any of these keyframes. So when we pull out these handles, our curve changes. And when we release it, the scale is going to adjust as well to make space up here. And we can tell now that we have increased the speed. At the start here, it is going much faster than these are. And we can adjust it the other way. We can move this one out to the right, and it gets pointier at this side. So as we pull this out, this left side is getting flatter. And flatter means slower, closer to the baseline, closer to 0. And the side at the right is getting faster, it's getting pointier. Now let's play that back, expecting it to start slow and then get very fast here. And it does. You can see if we just play back this last few seconds, it really pops into that final size really quickly. We can see over just 2 or 3 frames, it is doing about half of its size. It is a lot more dynamic of a motion than the rest of this easing here. And by dynamic, I just mean a lot more contrast. There's more slow parts and more fast parts. Now what we've just done here is the most fundamental way we can change our timing in our motion graphics. The highest level of amazingly fluid, smooth, captivating motion is made by manipulating the curves that control the speed of a value, whether in the speed graph or in the value graph. In the graph editor, this is where you make those really precise timing changes. Now we can get a lot deeper, and we will over the course of this course, but for now that is all we need to know. And you will be getting very comfortable with this over the coming weeks. I will make sure of that. So let's go back to how it was, which we can do by selecting these keyframes and hitting F9, which brings them all back to that easy ease. And let's increase how dynamic all of these eases are, which will create just a bit more of an interesting pulse. So we're going to select all of these keyframes just by clicking and dragging. We're doing that because now we can edit them all at the same time, which is great when we want a consistent speed across the 3 of them. So let's start expanding on the left side. And as we do that, if we look closely, we can see there's this little dialog box that comes up, which tells us the speed and the influence. And the percentage of influence is changing as we expand this line horizontally, whereas we expand this handle. And the influence means how influential this keyframe is in terms of timing. So how long this property is going to stay at this value. At the moment, just looking at the one on the left here, this is the keyframe at 0% scale, and we're increasing its influence of how long this animation is going to stay close to 0%. So if its influence is 0 at the very start here, it is only going to be at 0% for a fraction of a time. Then it's going to move very quickly away from that value. Whereas if we drag it out up to 100%, it is going to stay at 0 as long as it can before it is then influenced by the next keyframe. So it's got a lot of influence of the 0 keyframe here, so it's going to be a lot slower, expanding out of that. And it's got a little bit of influence into the next keyframe, so that will slow it down before it hits the 50% of the 1 second mark. Big handle means big influence. Now we can make these handles shorter at this side. Let's move these down to 0%. So this is not going to have very much influence at all going into this keyframe at 1 second. So all the influence is at 0%. So it's slowly coming out of 0 and then really snapping into that 50%. And then from that 50%, it has a lot of influence going forward. So it's going to stay 50% for quite a while until it snaps into 100% and then continues. And looking at our graph, we can see it's very slow and then fast. So we have a small amount of time where it is very fast, and that creates a very snappy motion, which is not what we want here. That is the very extremes of how we can push this. So we could also increase this handle out more towards the left to have even more influence. So both keyframes are having 100% influence. So that means the animation stays at each of them for a long time, and then there is only a couple of keyframes in the middle where it really just snaps into that final speed. And this can create a really interesting look. Essentially, this is as dynamic as we can get animating these properties. So we have a very low speed graph here where it's moving very slow, and then a real snap in the middle. And you're going to get a much better sense of how these work once you have spent a lot of time playing with these. For some of you, this might be really intuitive. You might get it right away. For others, it might take quite a while to sort of connect those ideas in your mind that this graph is visually representing the speed of the animation on screen. Especially if you're really new to this, I am throwing a lot at you to do with a timeline and properties and representing the speed of those properties as an abstract graph here, and then let alone manipulating the influence of those with these handles. So I do apologize if that sounds really complicated, but I do think it's best to lay out as clearly as possible what the speed graph is actually doing. It forms a little bit of a stronger connection in your mind that, oh, when these spikes are higher, it's going faster, and how the handles are actually manipulating and influencing that. But really, all you need to take away at this early stage is when the graph is lower, the animation moves slower. When it's higher, they move faster. Now also, when I'm dragging these handles, I'm very careful to keep them pretty perfectly horizontal, because you can move them up across the baseline and create things like this, and that creates some pretty interesting wild results, as you can see, but that gets a bit complicated. So I'm going to undo that, and we're just going to stick to keeping it on the baseline here, because that is all we need for this animation. Again, if you are new to this and you are scared of the graph editor, it is okay. Everyone's scared of it the first time they go in there, and they're normally scared of it for the rest of their career. But I want to break through that as quickly as possible, which is why I'm spending so much time on it. Okay, so now let's find a nice balance where it's got a little bit of dynamic motion, but not too much. And here is actually looking pretty good. Let's go and find an influence of about, I think, 75% either side. I'm not going to be too exact. Eyeballing it is fine, because really the difference between a few percent at this scale isn't really going to be that noticeable. So around 70%, and you also notice that is, 70% towards this line, 3/4 of the way through, which is very convenient. You can see the influence is at 100% when this handle is exactly halfway between it and the next keyframe. So let's play that back, and that's looking nice and smooth. Got some nice pulsing animation. It's not snapping too much. It's moving quite a bit in the middle of these keyframes here, which is what we like. Okay, that is looking good. Great, our first circle is done. We're almost there. Now it is just a case of duplicating it and then offsetting and layering them creatively. Okay, now let's pop into our timeline view. We do not need to go into the graph editor again, because we've already set the timings. Really, you only go into the graph editor when you need to adjust the timings, then everything else is much easier to see in the regular timeline. Let's make this a little smaller as well, so we can put the focus back on our composition window. And we are going to rename the shape layer, because shape layer 1, you know me, we always label our shape layers. So I'm going to hit enter and rename that just to circle. If you've seen any of my work before, you know that it is very important for me to label my layers, keep this as organized as possible. Again, like I said earlier with the project panel, the project is only going to get more chaotic the more you do to it. So keeping it as organized as possible from the start is going to really pay off, and is going to be much easier to handle and navigate the more and more we start adding. Now we're going to select and duplicate this circle with Control or Command D, which is going to create another copy of it, a duplicate. And now we're going to change its color, which we can do from selecting the fill up here, where we can change its color. We'll see it updating. But we really want to match exactly our style frame, which we can see in the tiny preview window up here. And this is actually big enough. So let's grab the eyedropper tool and we can select the next color, which is this sort of a rust colored red here. I'm going to select that and hit OK. Now we have our second circle and we're going to drag this over to start 1 second later. And it can be helpful to see the keyframes that we're working with here. So a shortcut that is also very handy to know is U. So we're going to hit U on our keyboard and that just brings up all of the animated properties of that layer. And this just makes it handy so we can line them up and see that each of these keyframes lines up with the layer below. Now let's play it and see what we've got. Look at that. Now we are getting there. Both are animating in sync and it is very satisfying. Now let's do the next layer. I'm going to select this layer, duplicate it, change its fill from this rust color to this pretty bright orange. Hit OK. Delay that 1 second. Make sure those all line up. Now we've got 3 circles animating in sync. Wonderful. Now the last color, which is yellow, so we'll duplicate it again. Control Command D, alter the fill, and then move that along. There. We can also zoom out now as well, here in the timeline, and let's see how that looks. Fantastic. Now you might notice a trend over how a lot of these animations go, where we spend a lot of the time at the very start animating in the graph editor, and then once we do a couple of duplications, move some things around, it really comes together at the very end. So if these projects are slow to start, that's only because all the fun stuff happens at the end. A bit like eating your vegetables first, then you get the dessert. We are firmly in the dessert mode of this section of the animation, where everything is starting to look good and we don't have to view that scary graph editor. But it's not scary really, it'll be your best friend in no time. It's misunderstood. Now we've got all of the parts here, all the circles in all the different colors. We need to get it looping. But before we do that, we're just going to organize it a little bit more. So we've changed the name of all of these from shape layer 1 to circle, and we could go a bit further, call it circle yellow, circle orange, circle rust, circle gray. That might be a little bit overkill because what we can do is change the color of these layers. Now by default, shape layers are blue. If you create a new text layer, that will be red. Different types of layers, like here is an image, it is this sort of a pale blue color. So let's change all of these layers so they have a different color which represents what color the actual shape is. So the first one is this very dark color, and we're going to change that by selecting this little square down here which shows its label color, and that brings up this menu. We have lots of options, and annoyingly, without any good reason I don't think, After Effects doesn't show you what color it is, it just has the name as text. Wouldn't this be nice and helpful if we had a little color that showed us what blue looked like here and what the other ones look like? And also these color names are pretty ambiguous, like sandstone and seafoam. It might be easier if they said light blue, dark blue, etc. But alas, this is what we're working with. I like to choose, if I can, a color that matches the layer. That's more intuitive for me. Now I know the closest color to this gray is actually none. So if we hit none, it turns our layer into this gray color. Fantastic. Now we can look down quickly and know which of these shapes is the gray one. It's this one. Now next we are going to do this rust color. So what color matches that? We do have a few options, and I didn't intentionally do it, but this particular color kind of sits in between red that we have here and brown. But I am going to choose brown mainly because the next one, this orange, is kind of an orangey red, and I don't want that to cause confusion, so we're going to change that one to orange. So we have brown and orange, none of them get to be red. Sorry, shape layers, you're both very close to red, but it's more important that I know that you're different colors than which one is really the reddest. And then next one, the yellow, nice and easy, yellow. There we are. Now we can see at a glance in the timeline which layer we are selecting. Okay, our components are ready. Let's get it looping. Now this composition is 8 seconds long, and this only needs to be 4 seconds to loop. So we can drag this handle here, which is the end of our work area. So now if I play with my spacebar, it is going to get to 4 seconds at the end and then start at the very beginning. It's very handy to be able to adjust this, so get comfortable moving this around and looping different sections so you don't have to play the whole animation or keep interrupting the playback to move the playhead back and forth. So we're going to keep it to 4 seconds so we can set up our loop. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to duplicate these layers. So I'm going to select all of these layers, just selecting the bottom one, holding Shift, clicking the top one, and then hitting Command or Control D. And then I'm just going to drag any of these layers up above Circle 4 So it brings them all to the top of the layer stack. And then I'm going to slide them all over so they repeat that same sequence. I'm going to hit U on the keyboard so we can see they're all starting 1 second, 1 keyframe behind the last. Now at the start it still doesn't loop. We can see our background layer here. And just be clear, our background, even though it is black, it is actually transparent. We can turn on our transparency grid here and we can see that there is nothing at all behind this. So we have nothing in our comp and then it fills up with these circles. So now the real issue with it not looping is we get to the end here and then when we snap back to the front, we've got nothing there. It's just transparent. So what we need to do is find a place here where our comp is just filled up, where there's no transparency, it is filled with these circles. And the very first instance of that is here, where it's currently 3 seconds, where we have every single one of our layers visible. So what we can do is select all of our layers and then drag them over so they start earlier, and on the very first frame our comp is filled. Now let's play it back and it should loop because we have got everything duplicated. We have 2 copies. So let's take this orange example here. So we start off, it's filled up 50%. So this layer is taking it from 50% to 100 to 150. Then we lose track of it because it's covered up by the other layers. And then at the very end here, we have its duplicate going from 0 to 50%, which gives us the exact same scenario as the very start here. And we get a seamless loop. This is another thing we're going to be doing a lot in this lesson and continuing in the course. So you will get more of a familiarity and solid understanding of how to loop things in After Effects. Also, don't be too worried if it doesn't loop. I've really tried to make this first lesson an assignment confined to these little individual mosaic boxes so that anything in here will look pretty good. We stick to this restricted color palette and do some small motion over 4 seconds. So don't fret too much. I know if After Effects is new to you, I'm really throwing you into the deep end with all of these concepts, but really if you just take away a little bit of what I've shown here, that is more than enough to move forward and keep going. Try not to be intimidated. All of this will be reinforced later on, and a lot of this stuff really gets cemented in once you actually start making stuff and getting involved and making mistakes and trying new things and correcting what's happened. So don't expect to grasp all of these and be an expert all at once. Okay, so now essentially we are finished with this comp. Let's add it to our main comp. So let's select Mosaic Main over here. At the moment it's just the background and the style frame. So let's drag in our comp 02 scale and we can move it around. We know that we need to scale it down by 50% because we made it 600 by 600. So let's change this to 50 and it is the exact same size as our one over here. Now let's zoom in and line this up. Now if we click and drag this around, you can see it will snap to the very center of our comp here. That is because I have snapping turned on. I find that really helpful, so turn snapping on, it comes in handy. But it won't snap to the middle of this section here. It'll only snap horizontally to the center of the comp. So what I find is useful is we'll get it to the center and then just kind of drag it down until it's close enough. I'm going to zoom in. I can tell it's not exact, but what I can do is hit P on my keyboard, bring up the position property. And this is a little trick I like to do. It's not really a trick, but I find it comes in handy a lot. We look at the position and we just look for a number that seems very close to a very even number, but not quite. So this 239 looks to me like that should be 240. So I'm going to type in 240, hit enter, and that lines up perfectly. Now, not all the designs you work with will have nice round numbers like this, but this one is because it's very geometric and I've made it that way to not make this first lesson any more complicated than it really needs to be. And let's adjust the work area on this comp to be 4 seconds as well. So we can see all of our loops. We'll make all of these comps loop to 4 seconds exactly. And let's see how this looks so far. There we are. 1 section done, 8 to go, but don't fret. These next ones will become much quicker. I've already covered most of the important principles in this lesson, so from here on in we'll mainly be reinforcing them and introducing a few other little sections as well, not adding too many more concepts.